on Straight Talk Africa, President Cyril Ramaphosa replaced Jacob Zuma, who last week reluctantly resigned as head of state of Africa's most industrialized nation. We discuss the reaction and the significance of the new man in charge of the Republic of South Africa. That's coming up next right here on Straight Talk Africa. Hello, welcome to Straight Talk Africa, live from the Voice of America headquarters here in Washington. I am Shaka Sali.
And hello to all of our viewers and listeners on the continent and elsewhere. I'm Heidi Adams-Fitzpatrick, your social media reporter.
Today, it's a discussion on the controversial political transition in South Africa.
And coming up later, our audience has weighed in on our topic through emails, Facebook and Twitter comments, and we're going to reveal some of them ahead here on Straight Talk Africa.
Expectations for a more focused and smoother run administration are high in South Africa, where following years under former President Jacob Zuma, Cyril Ramaphosa is now at the helm in Pretoria. My colleague, Paul Cisco, has more.
Jacob Zuma's resignation after 9 years as South Africa's president leaves the once invincible African National Congress Party with a few difficulties to work out as the nation moves forward under new President Cyril Ramaphosa. After some brief levity,
cross-affirmation, I've had some say, I swear, I affirm, just to avoid.
Cyril Ramaphosa was sworn in as the country's president on February 15th.
So help me God.
After the inauguration, President Ramaphosa said these are the beginnings of a new day for South Africa, and he vowed to restore the once robust economy of Africa's most industrialized nation. Referring to the multitude of criminal allegations that forced Jacob Zuma's resignation, South Africa's new leader is promising to tackle government graft and corruption head-on.
Issues that have to do with corruption, issues of how we can straighten out our state-owned enterprises, and how we deal with state capture are issues that are on our radar screen.
After years of a faltering economy, characterized by political scandal and accusations of corruption surrounding former President Zuma, many South Africans have high hopes for the future of the nation under President Ramaphosa. Ramaphosa told lawmakers he hopes to unify the various political parties to better serve the people of South Africa.
And I'll seek to execute that task with humility, with faithfulness, and with dignity as well.
It won't be an easy task, according to political analyst Sibusiso Nkomo.
He needs a few scalps, and those scalps have to be they have to be top people. But also, I think it's a culture that he needs to set, and it's a very difficult task. But I think if he pushes through, and this is what he focuses on the most, and maybe the economy, people will reward him.
Como says the ruling ANC party will quickly lose support if Ramaphosa doesn't deal with corruption head-on.
You have a corrupt government, and here you say you want to clean up. He actually has to clean up because the 2016 local government elections showed us that South Africans have moved beyond loyalty.
South African citizens have differing opinions about President Zuma's tenure.
I do think that, it was way overdue. Yeah, I feel very indifferent to just the whole system, the ANC, but it's better that he's gone.
I don't know if it's going to be a good thing that Zuma is leaving, because Zuma has done so many things in our residence.
Zuma, who took office in May of 2009, maintains his innocence despite the allegations that led to his resignation. As Ramaphosa takes control of the country, the main opposition Democratic Alliance Party has been quick and firm in challenging him to make good on his promises with concrete actions. Paul Cisco, VOA News, Washington.
Thanks, Paul, for that report. For more on the significance of the changing of the guard in Pretoria, we are joined live via Skype by Patrick Bond, Professor of Political Economy at the University of the Witwatersrand, or WITS, in Johannesburg. Good evening, Professor Bond.
It's great to be with you and the viewers. Thanks very much for having me, Shaka.
It's really a pleasure having you on the program for the first time, Professor Bond.
Likewise.
Talk to me about the mood from your vantage point, given the changes that occurred last week.
Well, it's a mixed mood because certainly the establishment business community is thrilled. Liberal Democrats who've been lobbying and doing quite a bit of street activism against Jacob Zuma, they're also thrilled. The opposition party is happy. The main one is the center-right Democratic Alliance. And likewise, the far left economic freedom fighters, the DA gets about 25, EFF around 8. And they're trying to get up to 50, even together. They've had alliances here in Johannesburg and Pretoria. They're not too sure because Cyril Ramaphosa will revitalize the ruling party, the ANC, before the 2019 election. And then we come to the unions, as well as community groups, environmentalists, feminists, and they're of mixed mind. I mean, there's a lot of concern, especially today after a big budget was announced, that Cyril Ramaphosa has bent too far to business, to liberalize exchange controls, to put a value-added tax increase today, which hurts the poorest more. And these are the things that will test which side of the huge class struggle in this country Ramaphosa will stand on, given he's been on both sides in his history.
One of the reasons that former President Jacob Zuma used to be popular is because he was perceived by many, especially the less educated, to be a people's president, to be a man of the people. But when you look at the optics coming out of South Africa, it would seem, frankly, that he no longer commands a lot of support. Is that true?
Yes, although, you know, there is a strong KwaZulu-Natal, that province of the Zulu-speaking people, where certainly he has at least half the ruling party support. And the outgoing leadership of that party were very dedicated, and his ex-wife had a lot of the support there, and Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, formerly the African Union chairperson, and the candidate who nearly beat Ramaphosa just 6 weeks ago. It was a matter of about 2% difference in the vote in the internal ANC Congress. And then Ramaphosa could rapidly move, in spite of having an ANC leadership that's very split. The Secretary General, the Deputy President, the Deputy Secretary General of the top 6 very much were in the Jacob Zuma camp before. And that means that, just as Sibusiso Nkomo said, really what Ramaphosa is going to have to do is risk losing some of those Zuma supporters by tossing out some of the corrupt leaders of the ANC that were connected to the Gupta family. Those 3 brothers, immigrants from India, had been widely understood to have corrupted major state agencies and the Zuma family, the son, Duduzane Zuma. There were plenty of other connections in the Zuma Gupta, even the nickname the Zupta network. And so that Cyril Ramaphosa isn't labeled Rama Zupta to fuse this very closely connected set of forces in the ANC in a real battle that, at least until last week, seemed to be half and half. Then Ramaphosa made some very powerful moves to push Zuma out and to get his executive committee. I think mostly because ANC leaders understood if they don't get rid of Zuma soon, they could go below 50% in next year's national elections and then perhaps see themselves actually losing national power.
We saw some optics, beautiful optics coming out of the Cape Town South African Parliament, where apparently now incumbent President Ramaphosa gave a send-off party, or held a send-off party for former President Jacob Zuma. To what extent would this go a long way, perhaps in uniting the ANC ruling party?
Well, I think people understand that had to be done. It was part of the gestures, so that, as Zuma himself put it in a major radio and TV interview just before he decided to resign, he said, "I don't want to appear to have been elbowed out by Ramaphosa. I want another 6 months," Zuma said even last week. And the main reason was to host the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa summit here in Johannesburg at the end of July. He wanted to be in a position, and some say to continue making deals and doing corrupt acts in that period. But the perception, you're absolutely right, is that they want to appear, unlike 2008 when Zuma very forcefully pushed Mbeki out with very, very strong support from the key figures 9 months before he was due to retire as a president. And it was a similar situation. Sometimes we call this the two centers of power. One, the president of the ANC, recently elected, the other, the president of the country. And they're going to have to figure out how to unite these elections so they don't have this continual conflict, perhaps every eight years or so. So that's the dilemma at the level of the sort of perceptions of political unity and their need to pull it back together. They may lose it in the next weeks if Jacob Zuma is prosecuted. He has 783 counts of corruption that have been sort of outstanding, and it may be that the next national prosecutor, who Cyril Ramaphosa must very soon appoint to get rid of the tainted one in place now, would actually start the prosecution, 783 counts. And we might see, especially with all of the Gupta revelations, people may be testifying about all the different corrupt links. Because really, truly, these Guptas had sufficient power over Zuma. They could appoint cabinet ministers. They could run multi-billion-dollar contracts through state agencies for their mates, this procurement system. So this was a strong, deep state capture, one that I would say it goes on all the time, and it's often white monopoly capital, as it's called, that actually makes the big money on this. About 40% of the procurement budget of the country is overcharged, and it's a huge chunk, nearly a third of the national budget. So this is one of the dilemmas structurally of having moved to a sort of neoliberal, corporatized, outsourced government, that now all kinds of people start coming in to feed, and corruption inevitably results.
Now, Patrick, you mentioned the concept of state capture. First of all, for those of us who do not live in South Africa, what is state capture, and to what extent was that associated with the Gupta brothers?
From the mid-1990s, and started just selling, clothes out the backside of their car. They were very poor, and they just found a way to regularly accumulate businesses like computers and then media. And then they moved into mining. So they regularly would bribe, the allegations have it, and now numerous court papers filed actually last week are now really making clear, by grabbing politicians in the ruling party and bringing them into their network and regularly bribing and getting major contracts with huge turnovers. Now, there were big companies. This isn't just a few fly-by-night politicians and crummy little companies coming out of the blue. KPMG, right, the big accountancy, its nickname here is the Wedding Planners, because they ran about $3 million out of a Free State agricultural department into a wedding of the Gupta family. McKinsey, it's a huge advertising agency called Bell Pottinger from London. And last September, it had to actually close because it had been so involved in the state capture. It was very much discredited. So the other kind of state capture, so let's call that the crony capitalism. I think in the U.S. called the state capture.
I can't hear him. Patrick, can you hear me?
I can hear you okay, but I know our line is a little shaky and the internet between Washington and Johannesburg.
I see.
Improved.
I was going to ask you one question, and this question is very simple. Who is Ramaphosa? And what is it that really makes him tick? Because let's face it, even the Madiba, Nelson Mandela himself, back in 1999, had actually chosen him to succeed him. What makes him tick?
Yes. Well, you're right. And in fact, even in '94, when Mandela was choosing a deputy, one of the concerns was ethnic balance and to have Thabo Mbeki from the Xhosa people replace Mandela. Xhosa was seen as a little much of a Cosa Nostra. That was the nickname of this sort of sense, maybe, okay, there's an ethnic power base. So yes, not only because he came from the Venda group in the north of the country, so an ethnic balancing is always desired in a country with 9 different indigenous peoples in terms of the different language groups. But yes, no, Cyril Ramaphosa, by any account, would have been certainly a far superior deputy back in '94 and a far superior president than Mbeki in '99. He would have, for example, given people AIDS medicines, and Mbeki denied that. But he has made such a major U-turn. You know, he was a radical student leader in the '70s. He was kicked out of the University of the Limpopo for very effective student organizing. Then he was the trade union leader, the National Union of Mine Workers. In the late '80s, he ran a big national strike and was so powerful and effective that Mandela chose him, and he was elected in a national congress in 1991 to be the manager of the ANC, the Secretary General. And in '96, he was given the job of writing the Constitution, which is widely hailed as one of the most liberal and enlightened in the world. And then because he didn't get a top job in government, he then moved into business. And that's where it gets very messy. He had two big companies in the 90s that went belly up, and there were major controversies over the personalities, but really the model underlying it. Too much debt and too much reliance on rising stock market values to collateralize the debt, to secure it. So they went belly up. And then he started getting franchises. So McDonald's, Coca-Cola, he worked with big banks, and notoriously with Lonmin, the company that in 1973, because Tiny Rowland was its leader, very, very wicked man, corrupting African governments all over. And it was called, at that time, the unacceptable face of capitalism. Unfortunately, Ramaphosa chose them to unite with his mining empire, Shanduka. And we probably all know, the viewers would have heard of the Maracana massacre. And that resulted, according to Ramaphosa's critics, from his emails in which he said that wildcat strikers were dastardly criminals and needed pointed action. And the police came in the next day, and 34 miners were killed. There was illicit financial flows with Lonmin, MTN, which has been penalized in Nigeria. And his own firm was exposed in the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers late last year. These are the kinds of things that give people a little worry that maybe he's not actually going to wipe out corruption. He's actually been part of it.
Final question. You know as well as I do that members of the ANC who spent most of their life in exile, people say they seem to have a sense of entitlement. To what extent would that affect the new president in terms of governing not only the party, but the country for that matter, and also given that he comes from the Venda, a very insignificant or socio-politically insignificant community?
Well, you know, it's certainly a question about 25 years ago, the balance between the internal activists and the exiles, particularly in the African National Congress. And Cyril Ramaphosa was pretty much the highest profile and most respected, maybe along with Archbishop Tutu and Alan Bosak, a few other leaders. But what I think Ramaphosa did very effectively was to move one of the big exile leaders, Alfred Nzo, out of that management job. He wasn't really that well suited. And then when Cyril Ramaphosa in 1991 managed the ANC, he could really unite all the internal and the exile forces. I haven't heard too much in recent years because we have very few exiles who are still in the top leadership. And it's really these people who've come up in the younger generation who are the key figures in whether Jacob Zuma, himself in exile, would be pushed out. And that wasn't on the inside or exile division. I think the ethnic question you're asking is critical because at some point the Zulu people realized now they were divided in this election last December. They supported Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, Jacob Zuma's ex-wife, the former AU chairperson. And because of that split within the KwaZulu-Natal, that province's ANC, they have nobody from the Zulu people in the top six. And that has meant that there's a lot of turmoil in Durban and in some of the surrounding areas. So we would want to watch whether that flares up, as it did in the 1970s and 80s, as Zulu nationalism against the rest of the sort of democratic movement. And I think there isn't really a Zulu nationalist movement to speak of. Inkatha used to be it. But there's always a tendency to elevate aspects of, for example, ethnicity in a complicated and divided society, one in which we probably have the most intense class struggle in the world. And now those might something play out.
Well, unfortunately, Professor Bond, time happens not to be our best ally, but we thank you so much for your insight.
It's great to be with you, and we'll see you again, I'm sure, Shaka. Come back to Johannesburg for a visit.
You're most welcome. Joining us in the studio are two distinguished guests, Ni Akwete, African policy analyst and activist, and Fiwokuhule Muyandu, Professor of African Studies at Howard University. Gentlemen, I have to say frankly that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host you on Straight Talk Africa, and especially you, Professor, for the first time.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's my honor. I used to watch you as a child growing up in Umlazi Township in South Africa.
Really?
I used to listen to your voice at 11 p.m., so I'm honored.
Unfortunately, you make me sound very, very old because you're not very young yourself. But thank you so much. Later in the program, we'll give our audience a chance to call in with your question or comment. The number to call is 202-619-3111, and the US country code is 1. Let me come to you immediately. When you look at the changes in South Africa, would you characterize them as a paradigm shift?
I would.
Or is it simply really the changing of the guard?
I think it's a little bit of both, because on the just changing of the guard, we must remember that Mr. Ramaphosa, President Ramaphosa, has been a deputy to Mr. Zuma, and he's very much a creature of the ANC. But on the other hand, his image and his instincts appear to be very different from those of President Zuma.
Why would they be different? I mean, he has been a deputy president to President Zuma.
Yes. That is correct, but you know, his personality is very different. I mean, a very quick and perhaps insignificant characteristic or metric will be even the issue of wealth, okay? I mean, Mr. Ramaphosa is coming in worth about $500 million in US dollars. He's a very rich man. Mr. Zuma was not a rich man going into the presidency. Now, there's been this side argument which stuns me, which says, and it's not just South Africa. Other parts of Africa, people are saying we need rich people to be president because the rich people will not steal. I don't agree with that, but it's the sentiment. So that's one where they differ. Mr. Ramaphosa, by every account, is highly educated, pretty intellectual, not as much as President Mbeki, but in that also the level of formal education is there. He's used to dealing with international global capital and major corporations, and he was in the labor movement. So in all of those areas, he is different from President Zuma. Yes, they both are ANC people and they served in the National Executive Committee, but also politically, Mr. Ramaphosa's political agenda clearly is to separate himself from the image problems of Mr. Zuma. So yes, I think it's largely a turn in a different direction.
We should perhaps also point out that he also grew up in Soweto.
Yes.
Obviously, yes. You know, there is also a very famous address in that particular neighborhood of the Madiba himself.
Precisely, yes, yes. That is where he grew up. And as you were mentioning with Professor Bond, and that was an excellent conversation, there was rapport between him and the Madiba. So from everything that you have heard, people say good things about sort of his intellect, his management style, but of course, since capture has become a phrase in South Africa these days, some will say that he wound up being captured by international capital, and it makes some people very uncomfortable. And I, for one, I think that this issue of corruption in South Africa, corruption is an important issue, I mean, anywhere, because it blocks progress. It needs to be dealt with.
Is it a new phenomenon?
It is not. This is my point. In fact, because it is so powerful and dangerous, we need to understand it in a nuanced way, not simplistically. It is not new. It is not just South Africa. And my big point will be, it worries me because there seems to be the assumption from everywhere I look that, you know, there's corruption in South Africa because of Zuma, and that is why South Africa has problems. I beg to differ. South Africa has problems because of apartheid, okay? Apartheid created huge problems, especially if you define apartheid properly as white supremacy that went on in South Africa for a long time. We never did an assessment of the damage done by apartheid, and even more important, I think South Africa should have had a post-apartheid reconstruction. It hasn't been done. So the deep problems in South Africa were caused by that, and it seems to me those that I call the Apartheid Alliance, those who benefited in South Africa and their allies on the international scene, going back to people like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and international capital who supported apartheid. It seems to me that now all they want to talk about is corruption in South Africa, so that if there is a problem, it's because the Zuma or the ANC is corrupt. They don't want to talk about apartheid and the necessary reconstruction. That bothers me.
Interesting. Professor Muyandu, you are a native of South Africa.
Yes.
You come from Durban. You come from the greatest city, of course, in KwaZulu-Natal. I was there about a decade ago, and I could hardly see in that particular beautiful city people who look like you and me.
That is correct, and that has been part of the narrative in that city, bordering on developmental questions and questions of who is a South African and who is deserving in a country that is has so many asymmetries of economy between the rich and the poor. The largest gap between the richest and the poorest manifest mostly in provinces like KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. So when you go in Durban and you've seen things like the xenophobic attacks and the narratives surrounding those, often we hear about South Africans are lashing out because they're kind of jealous of foreigners and so on and so forth. But much of this is actually an organic, very violent and must be condemned reaction by the people to exactly the phenomenon you're talking about, which is very unfortunate.
You know, it's more than 2 decades now since apartheid came to an end, and South Africa got in a sort of rebirth, really, and was under the control for the first time under the indigenous South Africans led by Madiba himself, Nelson Mandela. How do you, for example, justify the fact that for a man like Cyril Ramaphosa, a man who is very highly educated, as we have heard, a man who is very intelligent and what have you, 20 years ago, he really was a very average guy.
Yes,
how did he suddenly become that rich, to be one of the top 20 South Africans, to be rich? And yet, most of the indigenous South Africans, up to now, don't really have anything, because land, for example, and most wealth, the last time I checked, still belong to the minority white group in South Africa.
Well, it was rather a shrewd manifestation of the African-American theory that the scholar Du Bois came with, of the talented 10th, during the Mandela years and the Mbeki years, that we shall find...
That was, of course, the idea of Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. That we shall find a talented 10th of amongst us who are going to go and who are basically going to give them shares. It doesn't matter they don't have business experience, but they're going to own shares. And by our people seeing our own black people being in these industries, which were hitherto exclusively white, our people first shall be, they will see they'll aspire. So it's going to quell the fires among the masses. But substantively, it's going to change the makeup of corporate South Africa. Unfortunately, current statistics would argue against that fact. Current statistics have it that no less than 80% of the corporations in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange are still dominated by white males. So, and speaking about current affairs then, that is what some of Zuma's supporters would argue about your point, that we were all captured. We were all captured in 1994. Some were captured locally, and some were captured by an Indian family from Uttar Pradesh.
You're talking, of course, about the Gupta brothers. Well, unfortunately, time is not our best ally. We'll come back to that later in the program. You're tuned into Straight Talk Africa. We'll have more of a discussion in a moment, including our social media segment. So please, don't go away, because we'll be right back with you.
Like Voice of America on Facebook. Follow VOA on Twitter. Join VOA on our YouTube channel. Like, follow, join VOA.
This is Straight Talk Africa on the Voice of America. Call us now with your questions and comments. The number is 202-619-3111 and the U.S. country code is 1. Call us direct and we'll call you right back. Remember to turn down the volume on your radio or television and keep your comments brief. Now back to Straight Talk Africa.
Thank you very much, Esther Gidi Uward, and of course, welcome back to Straight Talk Africa, live from Washington. It's time to bring in our social media reporter, Heidi Adams-Fitzpatrick. Take it away, Heidi.
Thank you very much, Shaka. And we've received really good social media responses this week. South Africa's parliament formally chose Cyril Ramaphosa as the country's new president last Thursday. He was elected without a vote after being the only candidate nominated by the parliament in Cape Town. And so this leads us to our question of the week, in which we asked, what are your expectations for the new South African president, Cyril Ramaphosa? Let's start with a tweet from Upano Godfrey, who tweets, President Ramaphosa is old wine in a new bottle. I expect nothing much to be added to the economy and the people of South Africa. We've got another tweet here from Kasozi Fahad, and he says, we expect nothing from the new South African leader. It has been the same trick used by the ANC to overstay in leadership. Now to our social media comment of the week from Facebook fan Greens Kansime in Uganda, and he writes, the popularity of the ANC had drastically declined under former President Jacob Zuma's endless corruption scandals. President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to make a number of reforms that will strengthen the economy, create more job opportunities, improve social services, and ruthlessly fight against corruption. Let's go to another comment here from a Facebook fan, Abdul Hakim. He's in Uganda, and he writes, the main challenge will be reviving South Africa's economy. It has slowed down the past 2 to 3 years. And our last Facebook comment comes from Bridget Gugi in Tanzania, and she writes, there is a fine line President Ramaphosa must walk with his victory. He should quickly push his progressive initiatives, but he must also know when to collaborate with a sometimes fractious legislature. The year is likely to be one of the longest and most confounding in South Africa's political history. Now, a reminder for you that we always appreciate all of your feedback. If you are a new fan, please do drop us a line at africatv@voanews.com, and to comment on our Facebook page, just enter these keywords, Straight Talk Africa. And be sure to visit us online at voaafrica.com. You can also join our YouTube channel. Just sign up to VOA TV2 Africa. And do follow us on Twitter at VOA Shaka. Straight Talk Africa also streams live every Wednesday on Facebook, or simply go to VOA's Straight Talk Africa TV program page that is on our website. And to watch us live on your mobile device, download the VOA mobile app. Now let's take a look at what is on tap for next week's program. On the next Straight Talk Africa, Ethiopia is set to undergo a major political change following the unexpected resignation of Prime Minister Haile Mariam Desalegn. The nation is now under a 6-month state of emergency, but the U.S. State Department says it strongly disagrees with the call to declare a state of emergency. A discussion on Ethiopia on the next Straight Talk Africa. And that is all for today's social media segment. Shaka, you and your guests have a lot of comments to discuss, so I'm going to hand it back to you.
Thank you very much, Heidi, for sharing some social media reaction with us. And of course, today we are talking about the controversial political transition in South Africa. our distinguished guest, Ni Akuwete, African policy analyst and activist, and Dr. Fiwokuhule Muyandu, Professor of African Studies at Howard University. Gentlemen, once again, I have to say that I'm profoundly honored and exceedingly humbled to have the opportunity to host the two of you on Straight Talk Africa.
Thanks very much for having us.
You're most welcome. Your reaction to some of the social media reaction?
Yes, I was struck by the first one that said that President Ramaphosa is just an old wine in a new bottle.
Really?
In other words, that we can't expect much from him. I do think that you can expect some different policies. I mean, I was reading his State of the Nation address, and I was also looking at snippets of the budget that was read a few hours. He's doing some things very differently, emphasizing that he wants to make a break. So I do think he's going a different direction. On the other hand, it strikes me that some of my big concern being you need to acknowledge and address the legacies of apartheid is being left off the table for now. Now, South Africa has elections next year, which means that before the election next year, there will be another budget. And so I'm thinking, being a shrewd politician, he's trying to satisfy the markets for now so that the economy doesn't sink further. But when it gets closer to the elections, he will tend to doing the things that the majority of the voters, which means majority of black South Africans who are poor, the things that they would like, and there he will get competition from the EFF. So I expect him to zig and zag a bit. So my reaction is I don't think he's an old face. We've been seeing him for a lot, but I think in terms of policies, he's trying to be very different from Jacob Zuma.
Interesting. Professor Muyando, are we looking at new wine in an old bottle? Because let's face it, we can't simply, for example, condemn all this type of governance, mismanagement and corruption and what have you on the person of Jacob Zuma. We'll probably look at the ruling party itself, the African National Congress. How could Jacob Zuma stay in power for 9 years up to now?
It's $1 million question. That's the beast of democracy. The ANC has one of the most democratic electioneering machines and election processes. So we know this man was elected democratically, both to be president of the ANC 2 terms, and he won by a larger majority or margin than Ramaphosa himself. So we know that there is appeal. The politics is local. Jacob Zuma localized his politics. He went, every time he was embattled, he'd go to KwaZulu-Natal, speak to a completely Zulu audience, or naturally, speak in complete eloquent Zulu. And that right there made him, if I may, a man of the people. And also, we must not underestimate that Jacob Zuma, in South Africa, there's always been political tribes. The prisoners, Mandela had his turn. The exiles, Mbeki and them had their turn, and his colleagues had their turn. Zuma and his colleagues who were, they call it in the bush, if I may.
Yes.
They were in exile within the continent. They always felt embittered. They were always felt because they were not educated. Unlike the others, they didn't go to Oxford and Warwick like Mbeki. So they always had, they felt shortchanged. And indeed, there are stories that were used to be told that some of the exiles used to tell them, you guys just fight, we'll run the country. And so it was their turn. It was their turn. And so with Ramaphosa, we're seeing the last tribe, those who stayed within the country. And so each of these tribes has a base. And for Zuma, it was the veterans who stayed in Africa and the youth, whom, right, of course, he fell out with in 2009. Short, not long after 2009.
With Thabo Mbeki. Well, maybe they actually fell. He actually, decided having very serious concerns about that type of relationship in 2005, when President Mbeki fired him for alleged corruption.
Yes, sir. And I would agree with that. And there's a Zulu saying, an idiom that says, meaning, do not laugh at him who has fallen or who has been injured. Tomorrow it's you.
You could be the next.
It is you. So with Zuma...
You must have read, of course, Darkness at Noon.
Yes.
You read Darkness at Noon?
I think I've heard of it.
Huh?
Yes, sir.
Arthur Koestler. They came for the trade unionists. I was not a trade unionist, so I didn't give a damn.
Yes, sir.
Then they came for the Catholics. I was not a Catholic, so I didn't give a damn. And then they came for the Jews. I was not a Jew, so I didn't give a damn. By the time they came for me, there was no one left to protect me or to defend me. Yeah. Is this what we are looking at now? Let's face it, 2008. You have the first time that the ruling party ANC recalls President Thabo Mbeki, from Pretoria. It redeploys him, so to speak. And who was the champion of that idea?
It was Zuma.
Jacob Zuma. Supported by who? By people like Cyril Ramaphosa at the time.
Correct.
People like Tocho Seksuari.
Yes.
And what is happening now?
Because at the time, what it was, as you know, Professor, you've articulated this in the past, it was a coalition of injured, of anti-Mbeki who have felt injured or slighted by Thabo Mbeki. The communists, because Mbeki would ignore them. The trade unionists, he would ignore them. The youth.
And he was not popular really in the ANC because, let's face it, you know that when they had an election for the Secretary General, guess who actually won? It was Cyril Ramaphosa.
That's correct. That's correct. He lacked the charisma, but he also had a large support of the market. And in a country like South Africa, the type of economy it always relies on predictability. So that has always played to the advantage of men like Mbeki and Ramaphosa because they play well to the market. Yes. But, so it's a paradox because then people like Zuma who might have a native, organic appeal, the market is always cautious about them. But but his biggest enemy, Zuma, was his own self, because in 2009 when he was elected in Polokwane, it was a leftist ticket. He was supposed to nationalize. He moved back on that. He was supposed to transform, but he put in a family from outside the country. They became the arbiters who would negotiate the transformation, and by so doing, he actually led to the formation of the economic freedom fighter, his most virulent enemy, who have actually had a central role in his downfall.
James Marema.
Yes.
Now, what about that young man? What does Cyril Ramaphosa have to do to make sure that he doesn't become a victim of Mr. Marema's constituency?
I believe that, I think it fits into his next year's, politics as we get closer to the elections. Because it's very much, look, the majority of the voters to the left of the ANC, as Patrick Bond pointed out, the Democratic Alliance is center-right. So then you have the ANC. To the left is Mr. Malema and the EFF. So I think that later, I expect there to be a fight for the votes, for the populist votes. And the professor said something that I wanted to quickly look at. You know, the ANC pushing out first Mr. Mbeki and now Mr. Zuma, many people are looking at it as a bad thing. I actually see it as a pretty good thing. Not perfect, but a pretty good thing. Because show me any other country in Africa where the ruling party has power over the president. So if the president is going awry, the ruling party can recall him. Everywhere else, the presidents dictate to their parties and the parties do what they want. And it's not just in Africa. And I think it's a good thing with the ANC that has strong internal democracy to say this president may be going in a place that is not good for us. He's made enemies among us. He's making enemies in public. He may cause us the election. I think it's a very good thing that the party will get together, have discussions, and say, you know, you need to move on so somebody better can step in.
But is this the Republic of South African constitution where the state is subordinate to the party, or is it the ANC constitution?
I think it is the ANC constitution, but at the same time, especially now that you have competing parties, if the ANC's internal democracy makes them unfit in the eyes of the voters, they will lose. I happen to think it is a good thing. I am very leery of parties dominated by single individuals who fund it, or who, once they become president, it's like, we'll do whatever we want. I will repeat, I admire the ANC's internal democracy where they can fire a president.
I think that with these changes, obviously, South Africa becomes the beacon of hope for African democracy.
Yes, except that I think I worry about, as the professor mentioned, the markets. Okay, Mbeki is comfortable with the markets. Ramaphosa is comfortable with the markets. We must not forget the markets were part of what I call the apartheid alliance. They don't want to undo the damage of apartheid, so they want to focus on corruption, make the economy grow, and we see them in other countries where they have neoliberal policies that squeeze the poor. No educational subsidies, no food subsidies, no healthcare policies. So I hope Mr. Ramaphosa will look at his base and poor South Africans and push against the markets to say, these people suffered under apartheid, the country belongs to them, their land was stolen, we need to be looking at their interests and what is good for them.
And I would hasten to add also that we must also look at this for what it is. This is the ANC trying to save itself from hemorrhaging leadership. Ramaphosa didn't win. This is a draw. If you look at what in South Africa we call the top six of the ANC, we have Ramaphosa, the president, then you have Mr. Mabuza, hitherto aligned with Zuma. Mr. Magashule, hitherto aligned with Zuma. Ms. Duarte, hitherto aligned with Zuma. Then aligned with Ramaphosa, you have Mr. Mashatile. And so it's a draw. So this was a compromise, which actually might not be a bad thing for the ANC, because and for the developmental project in South Africa, because the ANC will know it requires other political parties' cooperation to get things done. But we cannot underestimate, of course, that this is a good for the mood of the country. South Africans deserve to be happy, and so they're very happy. But the substance. And I'm going to agree with your viewer who saw that, yes, Ramaphosa has always been there. And yes, this is the ANC trying to save itself from the EFF, which is coming. If you look at the EFF, it is what they call the 7 cardinal pillars. Most of the speech of the things that Ramaphosa talked about in his State of the Nation speech are actually lifted from the economic freedom fighters' cardinal pillars. Most among them is the appropriation of land without compensation. You would have never heard Thabo Mbeki talk like that.
Very interesting. What about the land issue? How long, for example, the vast majority, frankly, of South Africans is going to remain patient if there is no such a thing as appropriate land reform? I'm asking you especially because...
It's a paradox, because what is this current generation of South Africans, many of them will form parties like the Economic Freedom Fighters. They are the ones who are younger, they are less comfortable with, they want to live comfortable lives. They know South Africa is a rich country. South Africa can afford them a good livelihood, and they feel they're entitled, they feel they deserve it. They're educated, they're very global in outlook. So they know though, so they're starting to question things like the Section 25 of the Constitution. You see, so they are saying that they've been telling the ANC that you need to change Section 25. We will give you a vote because the ANC for the first time in the 2014 elections didn't get a 2/3 majority, which means that, which was a good news if you don't want to give back the land. But if you want the land and you are an African in South Africa, that was a death knell to changing the constitution. But then these new political parties have come and said, we'll give you, and the ANC declined. It will be interesting to see if Ramaphosa will do so. I'm confident because Ramaphosa is used to putting out fires.
He's used to do what?
Because this, you said it yourself earlier in the show, this is a vendor. One of the smaller, more marginalized of our people. He grew up in Johannesburg. So all his life, he's used to pleasing different sectors of society. He speaks fluent isiZulu, fluent Sesotho, fluent Sepedi, fluent Afrikaans, fluently, more so, sometimes some people say more than his own vendor. So this is a man who is very used to dealing and placating different factions within the society, including Zuma himself this week by throwing him the farewell party. It was genius. It was a signature Ramaphosa move. So I am actually of the optimistic view that we might see the land be appropriated, the land question settled within Ramaphosa's presidency. In fact, his first term might actually rest on that question alone.
And I think I'm somewhat optimistic too, because in his State of the Nation, even when he won the ANC presidency, not the national presidency, his first speech, the ANC National Executive Committee actually took a vote. And they said, we want to expropriate land without payment. So, and when he did his State of the Nation, he also mentioned it. And in terms of the party that was given to Mr. Zuma, yes, I think it was a nice gesture, but it also makes me wonder what else was he promised before he agreed to resign. Because remember, on the day he resigned, he had given an earlier interview where he says, I don't know why they want me to resign. Why should I resign? I want to stay.
But did he have options really?
He didn't, but maybe even if you take it as a bargaining chip, what was he offered hours later for him to come out on TV and say, I am leaving? I do also think, and I think the professor will know more about this than me, but I think because the ANC does not want to lose too much in KwaZulu-Natal, so how they treat Zuma is going to be very important, both privately and publicly, because if Zuma gets angry at the ANC in the next election, they will be in trouble in KwaZulu-Natal.
In fact, I was going to ask you, Professor Muyandu, yes, that what does President Ramaphosa really, what does he have to do? What does he have to do in order to make sure that he does not lose the support of Mushorozi, Mr. Zuma? Because without it, as Ni Akwete says, it's quite possible that he could, in fact, may not even win the election next year.
That is correct. I think events beyond his control in the intervening months before the conference of the ANC might have already helped him. In the intervening months, the Zulu King, for example, was feeling very marginalized and made certain speeches. His Majesty made certain speeches berating the government for ignoring traditional leaders, looking down on them, and only coming to them when it needs votes for the elections. So it would be healthy to say the Zulu King, and among other kings, was not pleased with the Zuma administration in its final days. And again, in a stroke of signature...
So did Buthelezi, actually, Chief Buthelezi himself?
Yes, sir.
Yeah?
Yes, sir. And in fact, Ramaphosa, the first 2 weeks after he became president of the ANC, he didn't go to his own king. He went to the Zulu King with the whole African National Congress top 6 to reassure him that this is not going to be a purge of Zulu speakers within the ANC, because already people were talking, saying within the top 6 there is no Zulu for a decade. There are no Zulu features.
Very interesting.
And so he has already neutralized Zuma in that way.
Now, given that South Africa is a democratic society, you have independent organs of the state. You're talking about a fiercely independent judiciary, a fiercely independent fourth estate, the media, a fiercely, as we saw, obviously, independent legislature. Yes. What can, again, Ramaphosa do to retain the support of Zuma? Does he really have any power, any cards, for example, to cut deals in order to protect Zuma?
I would say he doesn't, even if he didn't, for a cynical view would be, even if he didn't want to protect Zuma, because the alignment of forces within the ANC currently, for people hitherto aligned to the Zuma faction, if you will, are still in very, very significant positions within the NEC, the National Executive Committee.
Right.
So he doesn't actually, Ramaphosa doesn't need himself to protect Zuma because Zuma is already well protected within the ANC. That is why I'll make a bold assertion in your program that we won't see Zuma go to jail.
You won't see Zuma go to jail?
He will not go to jail.
Or if he is convicted, at least he can be pardoned, just like Richard Nixon was pardoned.
That is correct. Because certain aggrieved forces within the ANC who lost or in this draw that took place will protect him. And so Zuma will not. So he's not as alienated as you might think. He's alienated, he's no longer president, but he's not alienated in his base. And that will be a topic of intrigue for the next coming year.
But why would his base continue supporting him when here is a man who had, it seems he has sort of forgotten them, and now hanging out with the Gupta brothers?
But you see, part of what I think, I mean, I'm happy to hear that because that was my own sort of, I was wondering, but I would have liked, because I'm taking it a very, a high distance view. If you had apartheid and FW de Klerk did not go to jail but got the Nobel Prize, why would you jail Zuma? who did more damage to South Africa, Zuma or the apartheid clique? None of them even bothered to come in front of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So we will see. I also think you are right about all these independent institutions in South Africa. But it is Mr. Ramaphosa who has to appoint the new prosecutor. And I don't think it's going to be a one-man decision. He may have a lot of influence, but the NEC will have a say.
Very interesting.
The most important position, one of the most important positions in the ANC is the Secretary General. They chair what they call the Deployment Committee. That is the committee that sends ANC members to
And that is an ally of Zuma.
That is an ally of Zuma, Mr. Magashule. So that is why we must see it in the context that it's good for South Africa. It's a catharsis for the country.
But the ordinary people, when they look at Kandla, at that Paris, really, do they still perceive Zuma as one of them?
You'll be surprised.
Yes. Because Mr. Ramaphosa is not poor either. So if they see Mr. Ramaphosa
I am not hearing, I'm not hearing well in my ear, but now I have heard something, so unfortunately I have to go.
Yes.
We would be remiss if we did not mention the passing of former Zimbabwean Prime Minister Morgan Richard Tsvangirai. He was arguably the most effective Zimbabwean opposition leader since the Southern African nation regained her political independence in 1980. The 65-year-old died last week in South Africa following a long battle with colon cancer. For years, Tsvangirai challenged President Robert Mugabe for the highest office in the land. Mugabe was forced out of office through a de facto military coup last November. Tsvangirai, who appeared on Straight Talk Africa several times, was buried in his ancestral home Tuesday. He was the founding president of the MDC, the Movement for Democratic Change, in 1999. We at the VOA extend our heartfelt condolences to his family, friends, and to his supporters and admirers in Zimbabwe and Africa. May his soul rest in eternal peace. On that note, thanks to my distinguished guests, Nia Kuwete and Dr. Fiwokuhule Muyandu. Thanks to our affiliate stations, along with our viewers and listeners. For many of our Voice of America radio affiliates, Learning English is coming up next. And tomorrow morning, it's Daybreak Africa with James Bate. On behalf of the Voice of America, thanks for tuning into Straight Talk Africa. In the meantime, get better, not better, South Africa. And please remember to keep the African hopes alive.